All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another edition from the Frontlines. Today we're talking about Israel. I am Gladstone, the Executive Director of Congregation Sharing Israel. I am delighted to be joined by Alex Lederman from the Israel Policy Forum. Alex had previously served as an Atid fellow, Atid National Organizing Fellow, I'm going to get that right, and an intern at the American Enterprise Institute and the U.S. Embassy in Muscat, Oman. Graduate of Yale University, a BA in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and a concentration in Contemporary Israel. Achla, as they say, in many languages. So we're delighted to have Alex with us. This comes at a propitious moment, I don't know, an interesting moment, which is Israel has just experienced the largest wave of, I don't know whether to call it civic unrest or civic engagement, or maybe both. I think perhaps in the history of the state of Israel. I cannot think of something at this scale and this intensity, and I say that having been at the rallies after Yitzhak Rabin's death and having witnessed the rallies for and against the disengagement from Gaza and for and against Oslo and many other things. So perhaps we should take a step back, recap, and just sort of understand, okay, what are we arguing about and how did we get here?
Certainly. There's a lot to unpack. It's been quite an eventful past 3 months in Israel, culminating in quite an even more eventful past week. So let's unpack what just happened, and I'll try to go into enough detail so that we can set the scene and not go into too much detail, because this is really a moment that's been a long time coming in many ways in Israeli politics and for Israeli society. So going back to the end of 2022, we had the 5th elections in a cycle of 5 elections. Many of you who follow this have been watching this series of elections going on in Israel. Of course, after the 4th election, we had the Bennett-Lapid government, which was the first government that was able to replace Prime Minister Netanyahu for the first time since 2009. That government fell. We had another election. And then following this election, Netanyahu formed a coalition. This is the first election that he was able to win out of that cycle outright. And he formed a coalition with his right-wing nationalist Likud party, as well as the 2 Haredi parties and 2 far-right parties. Going into 2023, we had this government with a 64 out of 120 seat majority in the Knesset that was poised to enact a far-right and religious agenda. And it was a very triumphant moment for the Israeli right, culminating in a decade where we've seen, notwithstanding the Bennett-Lapid government, which spanned the ideological spectrum, but really a decade where we've seen the Israeli right gain power and marginalize the other voices in Israeli society. So we have this right-wing government that for the first time doesn't include any centrist parties or any left-wing parties ready to set its agenda. And one of its priorities was a so-called reform of the Israeli Supreme Court and judicial system, and addressing the balances of power in Israeli society between the various branches of government. In one sense, this was there certainly is a legitimate need, and I can get more into why that is, for addressing the balance of power between the branches in Israeli society, because Israel has no constitution. So many of the ways in which the branches of government in Israel interact are not established on a solid constitutional framework, and that in and of itself is an issue. But what this government set out to do was concentrate all power in the executive/legislative branch in Israel. Because it's a parliamentary system, there really is no distinction between the legislative and the executive. The executive, by definition, controls a majority in the Knesset, in the one house of parliament in Israel. So basically, removing the ability of the judicial system, specifically the Supreme Court, to serve as a check on that executive branch. On the one hand, this has been a right-wing priority in Israel for decades, because the right wing, both the Haredi right, which not necessarily is right wing, but the ultra-Orthodox,
Right.
have long seen the High Court as a check on their ability to, they've seen it as pulling Israel too much in the direction of democratic and not enough in the direction of being Jewish. And then also the settlement movement has long seen the High Court or the Supreme Court as a check on their ability to enact their agenda in the territories, for example, striking down settlement construction or preventing them to build where they want to build. So this has been a right-wing priority for a while to restrain the power of the Supreme Court. The other important piece of this to understand is that Netanyahu is a prime minister who is serving under, who was under criminal indictment. And he's on trial in the Jerusalem District Court for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate counts. This is an unprecedented situation in Israeli history. So we have a prime minister who has an interest in restraining the judicial system inherently because he is on trial for charges that he claims are not legitimate, and that he's professing to be innocent, but he inherently has an interest in restraining the court. So this government comes in, it has a majority, and it's able to fulfill this priority of restraining the Supreme Court and concentrating power in the executive and legislative, and essentially removing any check on the ability of the Knesset majority to do what it wants. And what we have are, so to step back, after the government is sworn in, Netanyahu's Justice Minister Yale University gives this bombastic statement where he lays out this entire plan and all of the legislation that the government is planning to put forward in order to take power away from the Supreme Court, which, looking back, was kind of a tactical mistake because it really got Israelis, it really woke Israelis up. And it wasn't a secret that this was coming. This was an issue that was discussed in the election campaign, but it really lit a fire that we haven't seen in a long time for the Israeli left, and really the Israeli center-left, and even to a point the Israeli center-right, who saw the danger of a government with a relatively speaking, narrow majority enacting a policy that fundamentally changes the rules of the game in the political system. And that drove Israelis onto the street. And for the past 3 months, we've seen a sustained protest movement in Israel, unlike anything we have seen in Israeli history. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets every day, or sorry, not every day, every week, but also on weekdays. We're talking about strikes that culminated in literally shutting the country down a couple days ago. It's been able to galvanize support, not just from the traditional activist types, people who have been protesting Netanyahu for years, but a wide cross-section of Israeli society that has woken up and opposed this judicial overhaul, what they're referring to as a judicial coup, that will upend Israel's democracy. So as the government has been going through the process of putting forward these so-called judicial reforms through the Knesset, this protest movement has grown and grown, and the goal was to get it done before Pesach, before the Knesset's winter session ended, and the Knesset was going to go on recess, which is at the end of this week, which is tomorrow. And they were at the point where they were able to do that, but last week we had a pretty unprecedented development in which Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who's a member of Netanyahu's own Likud party, gave a press conference that he was going to give and then delayed it and then ended up giving it 2 days later, in which he called on the government to pause the judicial reforms because of the threat that it's posing to Israel's national security. And I can go into more detail as to why the judicial reforms pose a threat to Israel's national security. Part of it is because of the uproar that it's causing within the security establishment and reservists in the Israeli military, saying that they won't serve if Israel essentially goes down this path of no longer being a democratic country. Part of it is its relations with the United States and other Western countries that are formed on the basis of shared values.
And there's also the issue of the International Criminal Court at The Hague.
Of course,
right?
Which
which people are concerned they would be given orders that are in violation of the Geneva Conventions. And because there's no internal check, they would then be liable internationally.
Precisely.
And it would make these people persona non grata. They could never go, to Berlin or Paris, or even set foot out of Israel for fear of being arrested.
Exactly. That's a very acute threat. If this reform goes through. So anyway, the defense minister said, I believe that we need to reform the Supreme Court, but we need to pause this right now because of the threat to Israel's national security in order to form some sort of broad compromise to go forward. And this is a guy who is not, he's not a left-winger. He even said in his speech, I'm a man of the right, but Israel's security is the mission of my life, and we need to pause this.
Right.
And he actually called on Netanyahu to convene the security cabinet to discuss the security challenges that are being posed by this reform being really passing through the Knesset at lightning speed. And Netanyahu refused to convene the security cabinet, which is really unprecedented and honestly quite crazy that a prime minister would refuse to convene the security cabinet amid legitimate and real threats to Israel's national security. So Netanyahu, a day later, fires his defense minister. And that really ignites the protests, which inherently there's a little bit of irony there, because these aren't protesters who necessarily are big fans of Yoav Gallant, but they see this as a step towards a form of government in which you're firing a member of your cabinet for speaking out against this policy that will concentrate power in the hands of the executive branch. So you have protesters going out, you have hundreds of thousands of people on the streets at midnight. A day later, you have the Histadrut, which is the Israeli labor union, which is very powerful. For the first time, went on strike, really shut the country down. The airports were closed, the malls were closed. There was traffic jams everywhere. The country was at a standstill. And eventually Netanyahu realized that he really had no choice but to put a pause on the reforms and say, okay, we're not going to pass this right now during the winter session. We'll resume it after Pesach, after Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, when the Knesset resumes in its summer session, which I believe is in May. And in the meantime, they're going to enter into negotiations with the opposition in order to find some sort of basis for broad agreement supposedly, on these judicial reforms. So that, broadly speaking, is where we are right now. It's certainly a victory for the protest movement. The fact that they were able to get the prime minister to pull back from this brink that he was about to go over. But the fight is not over, and it's important to remember that these, specifically the first major bill of the judicial overhaul, which would change the makeup of Israel's Judicial Selection Committee, basically is a loaded gun on the table right now. It's prepared for its final 2 readings in the Knesset that could happen within 24 hours. They could call emergency session and pass it anytime that they want. So this is not going away. And after Netanyahu initiated his pause, the coalition kept essentially bringing it up to the point where it was prepared for these final readings. So this is not going away. The question is now, with these, with the judicial reform on pause, with Israel entering this period of religious holidays and also the so-called national high holiday season of Israel with Yom HaShoah and also Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day.
It's also Easter and Ramadan.
Also, yes, also Easter and Ramadan, which Ramadan, the confluence of Ramadan and Pesach presenting its own set of unique challenges, which we can certainly get into. The question is what's going to happen with the protest movement? Are they going to stay out on the streets and protest? And by doing so, do they maybe lose some steam because people have lives and are full-time activists and need to continue on and get back to work and get back to life? And are they going to start to alienate people for attempting to shut down the country during this time when we're supposedly engaging in discussions for compromise? And as the opposition parties are going into this compromise, is it going to be used potentially as a fig leaf for attempting to just kind of put a rubber stamp on the reforms as they are without making really substantive changes going forward, and what happens when we resume? So I guess I'll stop there. That's where we are right now.
There's a bunch of different angles to come at this. I want to start with just sort of like the international angle. So there was a piece today that I read that talked about the two parties that Netanyahu would have liked to have received him well and allow him to sort of bank some achievements were the United Arab Emirates and the United States. And both of them have largely given him an incredibly cold shoulder and sort of the nature of his miscalculation there. You know, and especially given your expertise around Arab world affairs, I'm curious as to your thoughts in that regard.
Yeah, the reaction of the UAE and the United States are, they have some overlapping concerns, but the concerns are different. So perhaps I'll start with the US. And this has been particularly in the news recently when there was that clip of Biden basically expressing his concern for the judicial overhaul, saying like, you know, this is after Netanyahu had initiated the pause, saying, you know, as a proud supporter of Israel, I hope that they figure this out. This is really concerning. Apparently, Vice President Harris expressed a similar sentiment. But there's a lot of tension because Netanyahu is upset because he hasn't gotten his coveted invite to Washington since he.
And it sounds like he's not getting one anytime soon.
No, and there's a little bit of confusion around this because U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, came out and was like, yeah, you know, after Pesach, you know, we'll get Bibi to come to Washington. They had to kind of issue a clarification to be like, no visit is coming in the short term.
Right, in theory.
Yeah, it's like, we will get him there, but we're not really rushing to do it.
Right.
And there are several reasons why, you know, we're at this moment of tension between Netanyahu and Biden in U.S.-Israel relations. And the backdrop of this, of course, is that Biden and Netanyahu have a decades-long personal relationship. They get along well. You know, Biden is by no means Obama when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relations in terms of Biden being a little bit more cautious, maybe pick fights with Israel, not as confrontational, and sort of more of a trusted and known entity on the Israeli side. And on the flip side, you know, Biden doesn't, you know, perhaps would rather be dealing with Bennett or Lapid as the Israeli prime minister, but he, you know, Netanyahu is a known entity, and you know, they have a history. But Netanyahu in 2023 is certainly not Netanyahu in 2015 or even Netanyahu in 2021, because he has this far-right government that he is at the head of. And his messaging at the start, as he gave interviews in the international press, and his messaging towards Washington was, my hands are on the wheel, you know, I set policy, not my partners, I'm in control, you know, things will be handled, you know, as they've always been handled, kind of projecting this business as usual approach, which really could not have been farther from the truth, and he was not able to keep that up. First of all, on the judicial reform, which is just certainly, if any, it's many things, but it's not business as usual in terms of Israeli politics. And then also on the Palestinian issue, you've had this government take a lot of steps that have gone contrary to the stated policy positions of the Biden administration, from legalizing illegal outposts to announcing the largest announcement of settlement construction in Israeli history. To a couple of weeks ago, the Knesset passing a law that will greenlight Israelis returning to the area of the West Bank that was evacuated in 2005 along with the Gaza disengagement. So remember when Prime Minister Shaloms carried out the Gaza disengagement, there were also a handful of settlements in the West Bank. What among them?
They're sort of north of Nablus or Shem.
Exactly. Yeah, this area in the northern Shomron, which Israel also disengaged from. It's actually kept their military there, withdrew the civilians, but they just approved a law to essentially allow Israelis to go back there, which violates actually a signed commitment that Prime Minister Shaloms made to President Bush. This is, you know, a long-standing Israeli commitment to the United States not to do this, and this is a big deal. It can't be overstated, or sorry, we shouldn't understate it. Also the recent security summits that Israel has had with the Palestinian Authority, with Jordan and Egypt, basically promising not to promote settlement activity, and then 24 hours after these agreements were signed that were focused on maintaining security during the confluence of Pesach and Ramadan, basically just reneging on those commitments immediately that they made to the Palestinian Authority to implement measures to keep tensions down during this time. So there's a lot of frustration among the administration. We had Ambassador Mike Herzog, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., be summoned to the State Department to meet with Wendy Sherman for like addressing down after this Homesh bill, the bill allowing Israelis to return to this disengaged area in the West Bank was passed, which is they tried to frame it not as a rebuke, but that's what it was. Right. So it's a tense moment in U.S.-Israel relations, and the digital overall certainly part of that with the threat to the shared democratic values, and Biden has, in his phone calls with Netanyahu, has expressed his concern, and of course it will trickle down into the security realm as well, which is of course a major cornerstone of the U.S.-Israel relations.
And the United States would, quite frankly, doesn't want to be dealing with this right now.
No,
right?
No, like, that's the thing. Is Biden
right between Ukraine and Taiwan? There are plenty of things to keep the White House up at night.
Yeah, but Biden does not want to deal with this. He came into office thinking like, this is an issue that I'm going to touch as little as I possibly can, and he's not happy that Netanyahu has been giving him headaches with this. So to turn to your question about the UAE, to begin with, the UAE does, in terms of the stability of in terms of the quality of Israeli democracy, the Emiratis couldn't care less whether Israel's a democracy. There isn't that same foundation of democratic values. What the Emiratis do care about, and are sensitive to, is the Palestinian issue, which, as I just detailed, there are a lot of concerns about right now, given this hard-right government that is committed to the goal of West Bank annexation and to settlement construction. And right off the bat, once this government was sworn in, you had far-right Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir visiting the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, and that made the Emiratis pretty unhappy. And the Emiratis and the other Arab states in general, but particularly the Emiratis also are concerned with Israeli stability. They're looking at this internal situation within Israel, and it's making them worried. They don't know what's going to happen. They want Israel to have a stable political system. They don't really care what that looks like, but if you look at the Israeli political scene now, stable is not a word to describe it. So that's certainly on their mind.
And their working theory, is widely assumed, is, given their rivalry with Iran, that having some sort of tacit alliance with the only other nuclear armed state in the region, which is Israel, helps them in establishing a détente with Tehran.
Certainly. Certainly. And we're seeing that with Saudi Arabia too, with the recent deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to normalize relations. It's not like these countries are becoming best friends overnight. I mean, lots of Israelis try to frame it as about them and talk about, what does this mean for our ability to normalize Saudi Arabia? Personally, it's these countries, even if these Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, even if they have their issues with the Iranians, fundamentally their interests are different than Israel's interests when it comes to the Iranian issue. Their concerns are certainly not as acute, but it is interesting to see how this is playing out.
Right, and in many ways, it strikes me that part of Netanyahu's difficulty is traditionally he has attempted to, as he builds a coalition, put himself, if not in the middle of it, in a place where he can play off the two sides of the coalition against each other, right? Bring in one centrist party, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, and maybe a far-right party, or maybe not, but then he can say, well, I'd love to do that, but these guys won't let me.
Yeah.
And now he doesn't have that. He is the left wing of his government.
Yeah, precisely. And you described it in exactly the right way. That's how Netanyahu used to function politically. He always had someone like Lapid or Gantz or Barak or
Lederman.
Or Lederman, who kind of was a foil to the Haredi, to the ultra-Orthodox. That was certainly the case. That was his style. He liked to. He was a little bit more cautious, and also he played that up in his ties with the U.S. Just basically telling the U.S. I'd love to do this, but I can't do it because my partners won't let me, or turning around to his partners and saying I would love it if we could build this settlement, but we can't do it because the Americans won't let me. And that's just been his modus operandi. But this is a stark departure from that, because as you said, he is the so-called left-wing element of his government, but also this priority of restraining the power of the judicial system and the Supreme Court. It feeds into the ideology of people like Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right finance minister within the defense ministry, and of course the ultra-Orthodox, and Yair Levin, his defense minister within Likud, for whom this has been kind of his life's dream to restrain the power of the Supreme Court. But for Netanyahu, it's a very personal issue. And he knows that these people that these far-right figures are his ticket to evading justice in his trial.
Right. Right. It's Upton Sinclair's observation about you can't get a man to believe something if his job depends on him not believing it.
Exactly. Yes.
So, in many ways, all of what's going on now. So, years ago, back in the 90s, it occurred to me that there was a tipping point in Israeli society. And I didn't know when it would occur between sort of the tax-paying public and the non-tax-paying public. And to some degree, it's about the ultra-Orthodox and not serving in the army and the subsidies they get, but also the amount of money that was lavished on the settlements that was disproportionate to their contributions back into the economy, right? So to look at it in U.S. terms, you might talk about someplace like West Virginia or Mississippi, which takes a disproportionate amount of federal dollars in, but then, screams about how much they resent the federal government's regulations. You say to yourself, well, without the federal government, you wouldn't have an economy there.
If West Virginia were a military occupation. Yes.
Well, right. So, I'm not going to touch that one. I'm sure somewhere in the corners of the internet, that's already been proffered. But there's this tipping point out there where the tax-paying public would collectively say, dive far, enough already. When it would, I kept saying, oh, it'll happen in the next election, and I've been continually disappointed. Is this that tipping point? Is the common denominator now not about, the peace process or, any number of other issues, but the question of okay, who is actually a productive member of this, society and who isn't?
Mm-hmm. I think that's the question in this moment, and it will be of great consequence to see how the protest movement responds in the next couple of weeks, and if it manages to play strategically in order to, maybe cool it down a little bit during the negotiations that are ongoing during the holidays, and then if it's able to mobilize again once this is top of the agenda, which trust me, it will be. This is not going away. If they're able to maintain that momentum, and they had this victory this week of getting Netanyahu to delay the judicial overhaul, but it's winning one battle. The war is still ongoing. The battle for the future of Israeli democracy and Israel itself and what type of country Israel will be is very much still ongoing. And it remains to be seen. I'm certainly very hopeful given what we've seen in the protest movement so far and how they've been able to mobilize and around a notion of Israel being a democracy and being Jewish, yes, but being a country that fundamentally ought to have this foundation of democratic values, of equality, of the rule of law, of minority rights. And it's, of course, we can talk about what the implications will be for the Palestinian issue, because that's a whole question that naturally comes from that. But it strikes me that it's the first time in a long time when for lack of a better term, Israeli center-left, that is those opposed to Netanyahu, are for something, are for democracy, are for maintaining the Supreme Court and maintaining Israeli democracy, rather than just Rak lo Bibi, not just not Bibi, which is what they've been really the past 5 election cycles when it comes down to it. And I think that there's a lot of promise in that, and it also gives me hope that progress could be made in reawakening the Israeli left when it comes to the Palestinian issue, and to the extent that the whole country has really been held hostage for so many years by by the messianism of the settlement movement, which, aside from the whole issue of the judicial overhaul, is a deep and enduring threat to Israel's democratic character.
Right. It's been interesting in many ways to watch this protest movement basically take back the symbols of Zionism, symbols of the state, right? So all of the people have seen the photographs of the protests, of the videos. It is a sea of Israeli flags, the likes of which I have never seen, right? You can go to as many Israeli Independence Day celebrations as you want. You will not see that many Israeli flags. They apparently sold out of every Israeli flag in the country. They had to import more from China. It is, but it's really interesting, and it seems to me, from what I've read, there was a tactical decision on the part of a lot of the protest organizers to run with that and not embrace, you don't see Palestinian flags, you don't see...
Not very many.
Right, you don't see, the red flags of the socialist movement, you don't see black flags. Like, it's not, this isn't like the milk protests of a few years ago. It was very strategic in as much as they said, what is the most common denominator? What is the point on which everybody can agree? Let's run with that. Just like whatever faction you come from, whether you're an Air Force reservist or, you're from the most radical, protest group in Tel Aviv, like this is the convergence point.
Yeah, and I think that was a really ingenious strategy, and it's really encouraging to see that was the strategy that they took, because it has been able to attract such a wide cross-section of Israeli society to participate in this protest movement, because they've been able to rally around the Israeli flag and be like, hey, we're loyal Israeli patriots. We care about the future of this country, and we're standing up for it. That's exactly what we're doing. And also, it kind of took the wind out of the inevitable argument from the other side that these people are anarchists, that these people are against the state of Israel. Bibi tried to label them right away as anarchists, and that kind of just didn't really pick up so much. It didn't stick. Like they kind of use it as a joke. They call themselves we're anarchistes terroristes. Like they call them, they jokingly call themselves like anarchists and terrorists, but it's because this strategy of branding these people as people who don't love Israel fell flat, because it's just so patently false. And it's also an encouraging rebuke of the strategy of the Netanyahu right wing in the past decades to brand themselves as the true Israeli patriots. They refer to themselves. Netanyahu and his political camp refer to themselves as Machaneh HaLeumi, the national camp, like the nationalist camp. The juxtaposition of the sea of Israeli flags and the true patriotism that we're seeing among the protest movement, as opposed to the narrative of the other side as wanting to destroy the state of Israel, is a very compelling argument. There is, of course, the caveat that inherently, when you have a protest for which the symbol is the Israeli flag, it alienates a lot of Israeli minority, like particularly the Arab minority, who otherwise might be more motivated to be a part of this protest, because they see it, it's more of like a Jewish Zionist issue. Like a lot of a good part of the Arab Israeli community doesn't necessarily identify with these symbols of the state. So that would be the challenge going forward, because if Israeli democracy is to succeed in the long run, it can't just be a movement that is the Zionist Jewish segments of society. You also have to engage the minorities in Israeli society, particularly the Arab Israeli community, if you want the language about democracy and protecting minority rights to really stick. And I think that that would be the challenge going forward. And we're also seeing, the opposition parties, like they haven't necessarily done a great job of including the Arab parties in their coordination. Even Ram, which was part of their government. I mean, there was one, I believe, joint press conference that they gave with the Ram party, But other than that, you mostly see the photos of the 4 opposition figures from the Zionist opposition parties, without the Arabs. So I think that's the major caveat I have for the Israeli flag.
And to a great degree, the whole question of Palestinian national self-determination has been sidelined by this, because I don't know that there is a point of consensus in Israeli society for it at the moment. And I think within Palestinian society, things are also, the perception is frozen in amber. Like everybody's sort of sitting around waiting for Mahmoud Abbas to pass away, and then there'll be a free-for-all to succeed him.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you read it differently.
I mean, I think that to address your first point about this protest kind of, taking us away from focus on the Palestinian issue, I think that there is, I think that in a sense it's not true actually, because we're seeing people really think about what democracy means, and we are seeing, more and more focus on, especially in this far-right government, what's going on in the territories. I mean, one of the major chants of the protest a couple of weeks was, "Ifo ayita b'Hawara?" Where were you in Hawara when we had this riot carried out by settlers in which they essentially rampaged through this Palestinian town and committed essentially acts of terrorism, and the security forces didn't really do anything to stop it. And meanwhile, they're using force against protesters in Tel Aviv at the command of National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. So there is, I think, openness to having maybe more consciousness and awareness about the Palestinian issue. And when Israelis think about what it means for the country to be a democracy, it's tough because there isn't a consensus among the protest movement about the Palestinian issue. And I think that for the time being, that's the reality. I mean, if you make it about the Palestinian issue, you alienate a good part of the center. You alienate these right-wingers who are coming out in support of the protests, and because the having policies that work towards the goal of Palestinian statehood, for example, or at least lessen the occupation or reducing Israel's footprint in the West Bank, those aren't concepts that have consensus among Israeli society. So there's an opening to work towards that, especially with this political consciousness that we're seeing awaken. But it's going to be a difficult battle ahead.
Right, and I think my guess is the protest organizers, they need sort of the Benny Begins of the world to be on their side. And Benny Begin, who's Menachem Begin's son, for those of you playing along at home, who is somebody who's been basically pushed out of the Likud party because he is no longer right-wing enough. Is it like he's sort of a law and order type, although he's a right-winger. So he's not in favor of an independent Palestinian state, and I haven't read to see if he said anything about these proposed reforms, but I'm guessing that they, not something that sits well with him.
Yeah. I mean, Benny Begin was for a time part of Gidon Sa'ar's Tikva Hadasha party, which is now kind of under Gantz's umbrella, which by its very nature was a right-wing party that was opposed to Netanyahu. That's
right. It was a breakaway from Likud.
Exactly.
Right, and it wasn't to the left so much as it was away from Bibi.
Not at all. I mean, Gidon Sa'ar in many ways is to the right of Bibi ideologically.
Right.
So on the Palestinian issue, he's very pro-annexation for before Netanyahu was.
Right.
And I think that's very much true. Is that these right-wingers who are opposed to this essentially power grab that's going on with the judicial overhaul, they aren't necessarily left wingers in any sense when it comes to the Palestinian issue. A lot of these people are very pro settlement, pro annexation, and for the time being, it's important to have when we're talking about the system of government in Israel, and we're talking about when we're having discussions about what the future of Israel's system of government will look like, it's important to have as broad of consensus as possible and to have the movement be broad and to have a cross-section of different ideologies and people from across society. And that's precisely the major critique of What the government is doing is that they're doing just the opposite. It's narrow, it's pushed through by a government with a narrow majority, and it does not have the support of people outside of these very narrow and specific sectors of Israeli society.
So one of the things that came out of this pause was the supposed bone that was thrown to Ben-Gvir was that he would get to set up his own militia. Now and this has been talked about at length recently. Although I saw one comment today that Bibi has promised him this before and has failed to deliver. And I'm curious to what degree how you would evaluate the sincerity of the Prime Minister in this, because I know this is something that's attracted a lot of attention.
Yeah, well, to quote Bezalel Smotrich, Bibi is a liar, son of a liar. So he, there
was a bumper sticker back in the 90s that roughly translated as "Bibi lied to me too." Gam Shekaralai.
Exactly. Yeah. So anything that Bibi promises, to take it with a grain of salt. Perhaps everyone.
The Dead Sea's worth of salt.
Yes, perhaps everyone in the Israeli political system at least can understand that concept. But I think that this is something that could happen. We're seeing that the cabinet is going to vote on it. They're talking about 1,800 an 1,800 member National Guard with a budget of I think $1 billion shekels. And I'm not entirely sure what its responsibilities are going to be. But if this does come to fruition, it's very concerning because you're basically placing this private militia under the command of someone whose priority, more than anything else, is just to create chaos and to just act as an agent of chaos and to stir the pot as much as possible, whether that's on the Palestinian issue or it's on the issue of handling the protests. He's in his role as National Security Minister, who's responsible for overseeing the police. He's been urging the police to use force against the protesters, particularly in Tel Aviv. Even when it's not warranted, because these protests have, it must be said, been largely peaceful and not provocative provocative physically in any way. So if this does come to fruition, which I think there's no guarantee that it will, but then again, with Netanyahu, you have to, for promises like this, you have to accept that they might not happen, but you also have to, consider the possibility that it might happen. He said he was going to make Ben-Gvir minister. He made Ben-Gvir a minister. That happened. A lot of the policies, the concerning policies, that he promised to carry out in his agreements with his coalition partners. Not all of them came to fruition, but enough of them came to fruition that we're in the situation that we're in now.
Right. So the other question that looms out there is, with a lot of this legislation, people have theorized that the Supreme Court itself would invalidate the legislation, which would then trigger its own constitutional crisis. Not that there's a constitution, but a crisis of governance, because then who's the authority? I don't know if you've been following some of those legal arguments or not, and sort of what your take on that is.
Yeah, that is really when we're talking about Israel going over the precipice, that's really the concern, is that we get to a point where the Knesset passes a law that restrains the Supreme Court. Any one of these judicial overhaul laws, for example, the one changing the makeup of the Judicial Selection Committee, which will basically allow the members of the government to unilaterally, essentially appoint judges not only on the Supreme Court but on the lower courts as well. So if the effect being that it will affect the balance of power in the country and subsume the judiciary to the executive and to the legislative branch. So if that passes, for example, and the Supreme Court strikes it down, as you said, we have a situation in which there's a constitutional crisis because the government is also planning on passing, one of its judicial reforms is planning on passing a law that's saying that the High Court can't invalidate basic laws. And of course, all of these reforms are being passed as basic laws. So to step back, I just want to explain what actually a basic law is and how we can have a situation where the Supreme Court is striking down a constitutional amendment for being unconstitutional, even though Israel doesn't actually have a constitution.
Well, right, because in the American system, if the United States amends its constitution, that changes what the Supreme Court rules on, right?
Exactly.
The question is like, is it constitutional? So if they, for instance, we introduced an amendment that said, guns are outlawed, then the entire Second Amendment, right, argument goes away, right? And any other issue you get, right? Because now the Supreme Court, the rules have changed. In the Israeli system, the Supreme Court is basically looking at, does this new legislation violate current basic law? And if so, if it's out of compliance with basic law, the law is invalid.
Yeah, exactly. So just to clarify, so basic laws in Israel, they have a quasi-constitutional status, which means that the court reviews legislation and will strike it down if it is in violation of those basic laws. So for example, there's a basic law of human dignity, there's a basic law of freedom of occupation. If the Knesset passes a law that violates those basic laws, that these two that were passed in the 90s that enshrine some certain rights, then the court can strike it down. The court also has reserved its right to strike down a basic law, so to strike down the constitutional amendment itself. And that would be on the basis of it just being an egregious threat to Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. Right. So that is a legal basis for that. It's important to note, and this is one of the major flaws of Israel's political system, and it can't be emphasized enough, which is that basic laws, the threshold for passing them is essentially the same as passing normal legislation. So to take the American example, to pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, there's a very high threshold for that. It has to be ratified by all the state legislatures or whatever.
It's a majority of state legislatures has to pass through both houses of Congress, be signed by the president.
Exactly.
It's a fairly high threshold, which is why even the Equal Rights Amendment never got there. It was like 2 states away. But they got to this high water mark, and then it failed to get any further.
Exactly. But in Israel, a basic law or an amendment to a basic law can just be passed by a majority in the Knesset. So that's how we're in the situation right now. Is this government is able, legally speaking, they are able to pass these reforms. They have the mechanism in place to do it because they only need a simple majority to do it. So that's why you have this fail-safe in place where the Supreme Court can invalidate a basic law, because in theory the government can just slap if that isn't in place, the government can just slap the basic law label on any piece of legislation, pass it with the same majority, and the court wouldn't be able to touch it, which is, of course, one of the things that they're intending to do through this judicial overhaul is say that the court is not allowed to touch basic laws. So to get to your question of what happens when we get to a point where the government says you can't strike this down, the court strikes it down anyways, it's who does the security agencies listen to? And who does the security establishment listen to? And from what I'm seeing, if I had to guess, I would imagine that a great deal of the security agencies would listen to the court in this case, especially because of the threats that have been addressed and how this reform will damage Israeli national security, and from the signs that we're seeing from within the reservists, and particularly from former security officials who have spoken out in this whole notion that the people who are serving in these security agencies, whether that's the IDF or the Shabak, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, any of these security agencies, the contract that they sign to serve is with a democratic government, and when that government is no longer democratic, they sworn allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, or to Israel's declaration of independence, depending on the agency. When that is violated by the government, then many of them will see their contract as being invalidated. And I imagine many of them will go to the court, but in any case, at that point we're at chaos. It's really a doomsday scenario because the damage that will have been done to Israel's social cohesion and will be practically irreversible, and it's anyone's guess what happens next. If it's civil war, if we have some sort of coup, it's really a doomsday scenario.
Right, and that's, it almost takes us into, almost like the Turkish coup kind of, zone of thing. It's really bizarre. I was reflecting on a guy I used to know was Turkish, and after the coup, that supposedly happened with Erdogan, he said, he was like, that's not a coup. He says, I lived through a couple of coups. Like, that's not how you throw a coup. That was a sham. But it really will be this situation where the question of whose side is the army on may be the operative question, which is sort of a bizarre question to be asking, because in the American system, we take it as a foundational notion of governance that the military is subservient to the civilian leadership. And although, there have been moments of real struggle with that, especially during the Trump administration, it held. But, to be in a place where the breach is that profound, and, the military and the security establishment is simply saying to the essentially elected government, sorry, we're no longer listening to you, that may not be undoable.
Yeah.
Right? That may not be a wound that heals.
Yeah. It'd be very difficult, which is why the next couple weeks are going to be so crucial to avoid that from happening. And it's inspiring that the protest movement was able to at least push off that from happening. I mean, that really, I can't emphasize that enough. That is a real legitimate victory that they've been able to prevent that from happening, at least as far as we can tell, for the next couple of weeks. But it speaks to a larger issue of the extent to which serving the country and the military and all of these security agencies are no longer seen as issues that are above politics and are above tensions that exist within the political system.
Right. And I guess to sort of endgame scenario that one could conceive of a scenario that sort of looks like, whether it's, the Green Movement in the Arab world or the Orange Movement in the Ukraine, or, one of these kinds of massive civilian protests that ultimately topples a government, through not entirely democratic means, but just sort of sheer force of civil society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, about that being not necessarily democratic, when you have a government that was democratically elected but is taking steps to erode the democratic foundations, I mean, that, I guess, is the ultimate democratic failsafe of having a protest movement that...
Right. All right, so let's call it not regular.
Yeah.
Right, an irregular change of
government.
Yeah. But that would be the largest crisis of Israeli governance ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, since I would say the only possible comparison one could make is to the Andalena incident in 1949.
Yeah, and we didn't have a state then.
Right. And that was just a civil war between two. Right. It's the civil war between. Well, no, that was during the ceasefire. The 48 ceasefire.
Yeah.
And that's basically a civil war that happens between the then brand new Israeli Defense Forces, and the what eventually becomes the Likud, but the pre-state militias.
Yes.
But it would be a pretty profound breach.
It would be, and yeah. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know how you come back from that, but
right. I mean, this is sort of the French. The French would say, well, this is now the Third Republic.
Yeah.
It would be a completely different. They would have to rebuild the system.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why it's so imperative that we don't get to that point.
Right. So as the clock ticks down here a little bit, we sit here in America, and as the American Jews, I guess the question is, okay, so what can we do about this? We're not going to stand, on the Ayalon freeway from here. What would you prescribe?
Well, several things. I mean, there are protests that are happening across the country. There's an organization called Unacceptable, which is an Israeli-American. Sorry?
What is it?
It's called Unacceptable. It's an organization, I believe, of Israeli expats that are based in. Actually, it's a global movement, but they've been holding protests in cities across the world and in the United States. And I think it'd be great if more American Jews showed up at these protests, voicing their concern for the future of Israeli democracy and showing solidarity with our Israeli counterparts who are in this very active struggle for the future of their country. And I think that it presents a really unique and very important opportunity for the American Jewish community to rebuild its ties with Israelis who share their values. And we might not agree on everything. There might be ways in which that relationship based on shared values is tested. But in realizing that there is an Israel that is fighting for values that we care about as American Jews, and it's important that we show up for that, and it's important that we nurture that relationship, and that we stand up for each other, and that we don't disengage. And I think that for so many years as a community, we've been struggling to establish what it looks like to have a relationship with Israel that isn't just greenlighting whatever the Israeli government does, and being able to have thoughtful and articulate critiques of what the Israeli government does, while also being engaged in and invested in what goes on there. And I think this is the moment to stand up and do that, to be like, we care about what's going on in Israel, we care about the future of this country. We see an Israeli government that is really antithetical to our values and antithetical to our Jewish values and to our democratic values. And it's important to add our voice and to obviously not speak over Israelis, but to add our voice of support, because we would hope that they would do the same for us.
Right. And would you suggest a role, for people to call, say they're a member of Congress and say, hey, I'm a constituent, I'm a Jewish American, I feel good about what, the Biden administration has done thus far, or I think, X, Y, or Z?
I mean, I'm not going to give an opinion on what people should do in terms of talking to their members of Congress, but I think that it's always good to make your voice heard. I think that as a community we've done a good job expressing to the administration and to our members of Congress our concerns about what's going on. We even saw Biden when he, in a recent remark, when he was expressing his concerns about the judicial overhaul, saying, acknowledging the extent to which it is undermining the American Jewish community and our relationship with Israel. And the fact that the President of the United States was able to articulate that, to me, is very encouraging, and shows that as a community we are doing a good job, and we need to continue doing a good job in making our voice heard on this issue.
And do you think there's a place where American Jewish organizations could be more vocal in this, and that American Jews who are part of those organizations would have a moment to say to the leadership of those organizations, hey, this is important, and you guys should take a stand on this?
I definitely think so, and I think that that there's a growing disconnect between particularly the younger generation of American Jews and these establishment organizations that for years their modus operandi has just kind of been we're going to support what Israel does, we're going to not really comment on Israel's internal affairs, and we're just going to be loyal American Jews, and that doesn't cut it in this moment. And of course I understand the hesitancy to weigh in on internal Israeli political issues, but this is not just any Israeli internal political issue. This deals fundamentally with the future of Israel, the future of Zionism, and fundamentally the future of the Jewish people, because what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state if we don't get to at least speak up for it and speak up for what we see in it? And I'm not saying that we have a right to vote in Israel, because of course we don't, and we don't live there, and our right to have opinions about Israel's future, it looks different than it does for Israeli citizens who are more directly implicated in it. But in other ways, we still have a very important role to play, and I think that engaging and having these conversations within establishment organizations is very important for elevating our voice as the American Jewish community.
Right. And I think one of the things that is felt but not always articulated if one of the roles of having a sovereign state is so that that we do not befall the tragedy of the Shoah ever again, that there is a place, right? People always say, oh, if Israel existed in 1940, right, the Shoah wouldn't have unfolded the way it did, right? Because those people would have had a place to go. And if that is one of the roles of the state, then a state that is governed in such a way that it might pass laws to say, certain Jews are unwelcome here, right? Or undoes, the law of return in some way to conform more to a more halachic version of Judaism. Really, like, that jeopardizes Jews everywhere.
Yeah, it does. It certainly jeopardizes our future, and it in a sense undermines Zionism itself and the reason for the state of Israel to exist.
Right. And that is finally, like, are there organizations that, if somebody had a checkbook and was wanting to waive it at the problem, are there organizations you would suggest they steer their donations to?
I mean, of course, I would plug my own my own organization, Israel Policy Forum.
Well, there you go. Plug away. Tell us about your daily.
So I work for Israel Policy Forum. We are a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community, and we're driven by our vision of ensuring Israel's future as Jewish, democratic, and secure by means of keeping the political horizon open for a two-state solution and implementing policies that further that goal, particularly right now in a moment where, as we've been discussing, as we've been alluding to, we're farther than ever from that reality, but that has been our driving mission is ensuring the future of two states so that Palestinians can achieve their national aspirations, and we secure the ability of the Jewish people to maintain our country as Jewish and democratic in the future. As an organization, we do this by producing policy analysis. That's part of what I do. I have conversations like this, but I also produce written explainers and also some video content and write articles and analysis about what is going on in Israel, explaining important issues in Israeli politics like the judicial overhaul, in U.S.-Israel relations as well, and issues pertaining to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then we also engage members of the Jewish community, like this briefing right now, in having these conversations. And we also do some work on the Hill engaging members of Congress. So that's what Israel Policy Forum does. I definitely encourage, if this subject matter is of interest to you, go to our website and check out our resources. We have a lot of very timely information about the judicial overhaul and also some timely issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, of course, you can talk to me if you have any questions about that, but I definitely encourage you to check out our resources.
Fantastic. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. There are more programs to come. You can find those at our website, sherethisrael.org. We hope you'll join us for our upcoming second night Passover Seder that is a benefit for our food insecurity program, Hamotzi. So again, thank you all for joining us, both here in person and online. And stay dry out there and avoid the hail.